Something important to talk about, especially for my friends who are in the world of sex positivity and teaching about sexuality, relationships, intimacy, etc. And that is the AIDS hoax. I am just going to put a link below this video with those words in a YouTube search, and then you can find 12 documentaries that tell you why there is no such thing as AIDS, at least not how we know it. First of all, though, I just want to say a couple of things that I've learned in my studies of this topic, and then I'm going to talk about why it would benefit someone to pretend there was such a thing as AIDS and propagate that. So first of all, how many people do you know that have died of AIDS? Well, if you were in the sex positive movement in big cities in the 80s, you may be able to list a whole bunch of people, and you will know that none of them died of AIDS. They died of Kaposi sarcoma, they died of infections, they died of all sorts of things, but nobody ever dies of AIDS because AIDS is not an illness, it's not a virus. It's something that supposedly weakens your immune system so that you can die. But back to what I wanted to say in the first place is what the description of AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Acquired meaning you didn't have it when you were born. Immune, your immune system that keeps you healthy, is deficient. And syndrome. Now, a syndrome is a very interesting thing because a syndrome, the definition of a syndrome, if you think of sudden infant death syndrome, a syndrome is something that happens that we don't know why it happens. And if we knew why it happened, then we would stop calling it a syndrome and start calling it an illness or something else. So the very name AIDS implies that it's something that happens and we don't quite understand it and people die of it. And this reminds me of the whole thing around vaccinations, because you have people who are staying up all hours of the day or night that are taking poppers, which are very dangerous, having sex with a lot of people, maybe doing drugs. And these people get and start to die of some illness that has been around a while, like Kaposi sarcoma or the flu or whatever. And it's blamed on this amazing new virus. And the vast majority of people who acquire this virus have no symptoms whatsoever and live for decades. That begs a lot of questions, obviously. But the syndrome means we don't know what it is, and the fact that you put a new name on something, you'll see this as well with polio. It used to be called something else, and they renamed it and put some new symptoms in. And then all of a sudden there was polio, and you lump illnesses together, you take them apart. You stopped being able to die of old age once they decided that was going to be not a reason on the death certificate anymore. So the last person died of old age in America, I don't remember what it was, 1955 or something. And now you always die of some cause. Back to the topic. So you have a syndrome, and the syndrome acts where if people do things that are wild and crazy, they get an illness and they die of that illness, and then it's called AIDS. Now, the other stuff is if you take an AIDS test, depending on what questions you answer. Now, first of all, they can't test for AIDS. It's not like, oh, here's AIDS antibodies in your system. What they do is they test for proteins that are in the bodies of people who are suffering from AIDS. And the funny thing is, if you are a black person with a lot of partners and you answer specific questions in a specific way, then your AIDS test can test positive, where if you're a white person with fewer partners and you're not gay, you will not have AIDS. Same test, same result. One person has AIDS, one person doesn't. And there's no generally accepted rule for what proteins actually make AIDS or not. I think there's 5 or 6 proteins they use, and sometimes you have to have 2 of them, sometimes you have to have 3, sometimes you have to have 4. And if you have 4 and you answered certain questions in a certain way, then you have AIDS. Or if you have 2 and you answer them in another way, then you have AIDS. But if somebody answered the questions differently, you don't. Do you see the problem with this? This isn't like cancer where you do an X-ray and you see, oh, there's a big lump of tissue that shouldn't be there in your body, so you have cancer. No, this is a very, very judgment-based way of kind of roughly pointing to whether someone has AIDS or not, and it's connected to a questionnaire. Now, if you have lung cancer, it doesn't matter what questions you answer. Were you a heavy smoker, or not. If the cancer is there, it's irrelevant what your behaviors were that led up to it. So why can you have an illness that depends on whether certain behaviors were present in a questionnaire to say whether you have AIDS or not? Or why in one lab is it 2 bands and the other lab it's 4 different proteins? Right? These are all questions that the normal public is not informed about, and the people who are dealing with this condition are not informed about, and many don't know about. And the very interesting thing that my friend Mark told me is he said he was watching people get AIDS. As soon as you get AIDS and you're told, well, you have AIDS, and then your whole attitude changes. You know, the placebo effect, right? If we give people sugar pills, they get better very often. Well, if we give people the anti-placebo effect and start telling them they're ill, something similar happens. And that is, Osho tested this. He had a professor who got up in the morning. He got everybody in on this big joke all day long because the professor said, it doesn't matter what I believe. The only truth is what's actually happening. So he says, okay, so we're going to do this little experiment. He didn't tell the professor about it, but the guy got up in the morning and he had his wife tell him, wow, you're not looking so good. You want to stay in bed? You want to go to the doctor? And he's like, well, nonsense. I'm feeling wonderful. And he goes out and his gardener is like, wow, you're not looking good. Are you feeling all right? And he's like, no, I'm feeling great. And then he had another guy come and was driving by. Another professor said, wow, you're not looking good. Do you want me to drive you up the hill? And he says, well, I haven't been feeling that good today. Maybe you should drive me up the hill. Once he walked into his office, he had his secretary almost like catch the guy, even though he's just walking in. He cut him. He said, oh my God, I thought you were going to fall down. You look white as a sheet. Have you been to a doctor? And then the guy said, yeah, I'm kind of not really feeling really well. I think I might go home today. And then basically at that point, they had the suggestion through a half dozen people that, yeah, you're really sick. And he started feeling really sick. And what Osho said, and whether it's this extreme or not, says all I would have had to do to kill him is have him go to the doctor. And the doctor says, yes, you're very sick. It's your heart. You'll be dead in a week or so. You need to get everything together. And if the guy really believed it, then what do you think would happen? He was already starting to succumb to the anti-placebo effect. He already believed he was ill. Well, we live in a medical model where when someone has an illness, it's seen as like this random thing that happens, that there's nothing connected to it, and it has nothing to do with behavior, and it has nothing to do with morality, that you got cancer. Well, okay, if you smoked a lot, all right, then, you could get lung cancer, and maybe it was a little bit your fault, but we're still really sorry for you and sad that you have cancer, and we love you. And if someone drinks like a fish, of course, then the liver fails, and we say, oh, well, he was a drinker and he kind of brought it on himself a little bit. We do see behavior in some things, heart attacks with a lot of extra weight, etc. But the thing about AIDS was, remember all those behaviors I'd said, the people with lots of different partners having sex and probably doing some sort of or multiple types of recreational drugs and not sleeping necessarily real well and doing poppers to make sure that they were loose and relaxed and having, these pleasurable experiences, and often isolated from their families, going to big cities and not feeling loved or accepted by those people who normally support us and our families because of homosexuality or some other morality. Well, if you're living like that, how do you think your immune system is going to respond? Your immune system's not going to be good, but guess what? Somebody gives you an out. Oh my God, you have AIDS, HIV, and all of a sudden you're kind of like a hero. Oh my God, you've got AIDS and you're going to die, and it wasn't your fault, and you didn't do anything, and you're not responsible for it. And you go from being rejected by your family of origin to probably getting attention and love because you have this illness that happened. So a lot of people died at the beginning, right? Oh yeah, it was really easy to go into that space. Oh yeah, I'm just a victim and I'm going to die now. And Mark talked about that to me a lot, and I didn't realize this when he said it, but he said a lot of people were really, just giving up and getting this, getting their sense of self-worth and their attention and their love via the fact that people are now paying attention to them, as rejected children, homosexual children of families, of Christian families. Anyway, I'm putting a link down here. The science behind AIDS it's very politically driven. What happens when people get AIDS doesn't make any logical sense in relation to other illnesses. The whole naming of the condition admits that no one knows really what causes it or how it works, though I suppose, I surmise that it has a lot to do with specific behaviors. And the more of those behaviors we do, that, not eating good, not sleeping well, not using recreational drugs often, lots of sexual partners is perhaps a part of all that, then the immune system is damaged. Another very interesting statement from a very famous sex educator who didn't want to go on record for this is that we can blame people dying in Africa on AIDS, and then we don't have to worry about the fact that we move villages around, that we pollute groundwater, that we do all these things that destroy the immune systems of people in other places where they don't have as much money or as or powerful lawyers, or basically guns at the end, to defend themselves. So if they die, it's because they're promiscuous and they're gay and they're having sex that they shouldn't, and they're not following God's rules. And so people who die in Africa, it's no longer because of sanitary issues or malnutrition that was caused by the white people going in there and changing things that have been running for thousands of years. So there's yet another bird that the stone of AIDS has been able to kill. So this is lots of love to anyone who has had AIDS, or who's been dealing with that, or which is actually a couple of very good friends of mine, and who is struggling and suffering and going through it. And there is a lot more about it from people a lot smarter than me. I think we need to wise up about it. Oh yeah, the one thing that I did want to say is, who has a vested interest in there being an AIDS? We were having the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s. The prime way to keep people under your thumb and keep them doing jobs they don't like, keep them paying money to the military-industrial complex, fighting in wars that are not helping anybody but the rich and the powerful, is to deny them their sexuality. Deny them their sexual expression and pleasure, and they have to find another outlet for all that energy. And if they're sexually satisfied, they don't really give a shit about fighting in your wars or paying your fucking taxes. So Wilhelm Reich said that. He said all neurosis can be cured through orgasm. I don't know if it's that simple, but I'll tell you what, after you've had an amazingly great bout of lovemaking, you probably are not going to go jump off a building. We know that, right? But as soon as that sexual revolution started happening, people started getting free. There needed to be a way to shut down that sexual interaction, that contact. And AIDS was a very convenient solution for the spiritual and political powers that be, the priests and the politicians, as Osho always says. But that goes back to Jesus, who had similar opinions about lawyers. Most politicians are lawyers, by the way. Politicians and the priests. The Sadducees and the Pharisees, who are keeping power over everybody and telling everybody how to live and what to do. That illness came along, that syndrome, and started killing people, and all of a sudden the complete landscape changed around sexuality, and all of a sudden people were afraid of it and ashamed of it and were running away. And there's a lot to be learned on higher planes about sexuality and connection and spirit and listening to yourself. And if we just buy the mainstream dogma about anything, there's probably deeper ways to look at it and think about it. So this is created with great love for all of my friends who are dealing with this issue, and all those who are also instructing others with it. I've talked to some very high-powered sex educators who say, well, I would talk about it, but I'll be a pariah, and I know what you're saying, and I know that they're not to say that there's questions with the official story, and I just can't mention that in my circles, otherwise I'll be cast out. There's a lot of people really invested in this worldview, this model. So suggesting you look at another one, and putting a link below for about 20 documentaries that you can look at that really go into the science of it, bring up some questions, and always follow the money. Amazing money made in the financial and the pharmaceutical industry for illnesses that were not previously. Attention deficit disorder never existed until we invented it and started creating pills for it. And AIDS also, it's not a thing that you die from. It's the stuff around it. And so, well, we've got lots of medicine that's very expensive that we can sell for it now. And, you know, the people in the FDA who are managing all this, they used to work for these drug companies. What do you think? They're all buds. Where do you find people who are capable of understanding the topics? They're from drug companies. So, you know, the right hand is washing the left one, as they say in German. And you have to take what's said with a grain of salt. You have to use your own mind and do your own research and figure out how you're going to behave based upon what you know. And there is a consensus reality as well that is not completely, perhaps not as completely innocent as it would like to be passed off as. Anyway, that's me about AIDS, and I've been wanting to say that for a long time. So I hope that's helpful to someone. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about this. Again, I'm not the biggest expert in the world. These are just directions that I feel the arrow is pointing. And when I start watching these documentaries, they ask a lot of questions that I don't see being discussed in the mainstream. So I'm glad that people are now starting to discuss these things, that there's forums being opened and looking at alternative solutions and explanations for some of the deepest, most powerful social change catalysts that we've had in my generation and beyond. So thank you. Probably best place to go from here is either bayraba.com, BAYRABA.com, or at Peaceful Living, peaceful-living.org, where I talk about community and health and things like this. Thank you for listening. Happy to hear any comments. Again, I'm not the absolute expert on all of this stuff. I'm just saying what I've gleaned from my thinking experience, talking to friends, colleagues, and watching documentaries about it. So thank you so much.